I was sent a book a couple months ago, and through a sort of serendipitous series of events, I've managed to convince the author to come on to the podcast and talk about the Civil War. It's so funny, this process of, getting books. It's amazing, but there's honestly no way I could read all of the books that I get sent. I can, hold them up in a video and say, hey, this looks really awesome and I'm excited to read it. But the chances are I get sent quite a few books, probably not going to get to read all of them. The exception to the rule, though, is Midnight on the Potomac here by Scott Ellsworth. I read this one in just a couple days and I loved it. It was a home run. I mean, it reads like a political thriller and it chronicles the final year of the Civil War, the multiple attempts to take Lincoln's life before John Wilkes Booth does so at Ford's Theater. It also investigates, who was John Wilkes Booth? How was he involved in the Confederacy? How was he involved in these multiple assassination attempts? It's a wild story, and it covers a sweeping narrative. You also get the wilderness in Spotsylvania, which, as Scott will mention here in the interview, two completely overlooked battles in the Civil War, and I would tend to agree with him. The wilderness and Spotsylvania are wild, and they sort of give you a feel for this change in warfare from this conventional Napoleonic style of warfare to a very modern style of warfare. Wilderness and Spotsylvania sort of represent those changes writ large, perhaps, along with other battles like Cold Harbor. It's a fantastic book, and I'm so excited to welcome Scott Ellsworth here on the show to talk about the Civil War, to talk about John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln assassination attempts, but also to talk about his creative process, to talk about writing narrative history. What does that look like, and how does one do it well? All of that and more coming up here with Scott Ellsworth.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Scott Ellsworth, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm thrilled to be here, Josh. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a book, just a little book, that came out, I guess, about a month ago now, Midnight on the Potomac.
That's right.
And I just wanted, while we get into this, I was thinking to myself, how does a story like this come to be? There's, obviously you know this, but people listening may not know, there's a lot of different things woven into this story. You've got, and it's on the title, it's about the Lincoln assassination, it's about the last year of the Civil War, it's about John Wilkes Booth. There's a lot of threads that you kind of put together in this book. And it was fascinating because you almost have 3 novels worth of subject within, this one nonfiction narrative. So I was just wondering, what is this process like where you come up with Midnight? Is it your editor going, hey, do you have any Civil War stuff on the back burner? Or how does that process come to be?
No, so I'll tell you, I'll try not to be too long-winded about this, but it sort of the book had an unusual genesis. On the one hand, I'm 71 years old, so I remember the late 60s and early 70s as a young teenager. And I remember how divided we were, but that's nothing close to how divided we are as a nation right now. And which is terrifying to me, frankly, and others. But, as I thought about that, I thought, well, the last time we were in this situation would have been in the era of the Civil War. And so I was drawn to that era because wanting to write books of history that are relevant to questions that we as Americans and as world citizens wrestle with today. So that was sort of one basis. Another basis is that, I've really been familiar with and off and on studying the Civil War really since I was about 6 years old. That's when the centennial of the war began. I saw the stamps, got interested in that. It sort of went on from there. And then in the acknowledgments of the book, I discuss a family vacation that was sort of a work trip for my dad as well, where all of us piled into the car in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and drove to the East Coast for the first time. And I believe my mom had gotten me this incredible book called The Golden Book of the Civil War. You can still find it. And it was a young person's history of this version of the American heritage history of the Civil War. And I couldn't understand much of it, but I was just entranced by these cool painted maps of the battles. And I convinced my parents that we needed to go to Gettysburg and Antietam. And so that did it. And then through the rest of my life at different periods, the war had popped in. But the real story is kind of a bizarre one. So after my last book, which came out in 2021, talking to my agent, he said, well, why don't you do a true crime book? And I thought, well, that's an unusual suggestion. And I knew Capote's In Cold Blood backward and forward. I knew The Executioner Song. I knew you could have a true crime book that had some value. But I thought, well, let me think about that. And they just sell like mad. I mean, the audience for them is gigantic. It's all women in their late teens to, I would say, their 40s and things like that. And so I sat down and I read 15 true crime books in a row and a lot of sort of current bestsellers. And I got to tell you that most of them are just ghastly. They're horrible books. They're horribly written. They're about terrible people doing terrible things. And I thought, I can't, no, that's not me. But is there a way to do a true crime book that maybe had some value and some positive message? So I dug into that, and I chased two stories pretty hard. And one was a set of serial killers who were operating in between Houston and Galveston in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s. And they don't know how many there were. I mean, there were like a dozen young women that were killed. And but the first set of victims, they were exactly my age. So I knew how they dressed. I knew what music they listened to. I knew why they thought it was a good idea to hitchhike and things like that. But it was also, I grew up in the oil patch in Oklahoma. Houston was familiar, and this was during Houston's great boom. And these little tiny country towns where everybody knew everybody were now becoming these huge anonymous suburbs. And that made it difficult for law enforcement. Plus, they built a, 6-lane freeway between Houston and Galveston so these killers could do their work, hop on the highway, and, be gone 20 miles down the road. So, but I just couldn't get that to work. Then I'd heard about about a really interesting guy who was he's just a regular guy from Queens, New York, nothing special, who in the 1970s, before Nashville was cool, decided, I want to live in Nashville. So he moves to Nashville, becomes a street cop in Nashville, and then becomes a detective, and he works his way up to the chief of homicide detectives. And he's this obsessive old school guy, and he sleeps like 3 hours a night. At 3 a.m., he's got a wife and kids. He'll go out and run 10 miles through the deserted streets of Nashville and all this stuff. And he had caught a serial killer, using old time sort of pre-DNA methods. And I thought, boy, this guy's great. And then I found out there had been a book about him. It wasn't very popular, but then he had hosted a short-lived true crime show on the A&E network. And I said, he's wrapped up. There's no way. So I ditched that. And then I was thinking, well, what was the crime of the 20th century? And some people might say the Manson murders. For me, it was JFK. And I thought, well, what about the crime of the 19th century? And I thought, oh, that's clearly the murder of Abraham Lincoln. Nothing comes close. The United States. And then I can talk about this, but as I started to do research, I found some stuff wasn't adding up. And that's really what got me down the trail. But the larger question, that was about Booth, but the larger question was, well, how do you make this into something that works? I've described to my editor the other day, I said, look, doing a nonfiction book is, and if it's you're attempting a literary, nonfiction novel, whatever, it's like preparing a Chinese food at home, meal at home. You have a lot of chopping, a lot of measuring, a lot of preparing, And then the coming of it, once you've got it all laid out, it comes together rather quickly. So I would say it took about 2 years to figure out the story and what was going to be the story. And but the writing was really just took about a year. But the hard part was really putting that together. I used these big foam boards and I put Post-its on it, and I'll have events and stuff like that. And I'll make these giant, kind of visual outlines. And then once you figure out, well, these are the threads, this is what's important, there's what not. And I realized that within the context of a year, there was a lot I could do. And it's such a pivotal year and a year that's forgotten really by a lot of people about how important it is. So that's a long-winded, version of how we got there.
No, that's wonderful. There's so much in there that I want to try and double down on.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a sucker for the creative process. I think it's one of those things that it's different for everybody, but it's so fascinating how each person approaches it. When do you know? I guess when is the moment when you know? Okay, this is a topic. This is something I'm just going to stick in my drawer. Come back to it. Maybe save it for a rainy day or something. How do you know? Is there like a serendipitous sort of a thing, or do you just go, hey, you're like building a house and the studs aren't working, and it's a very practical sort of a thing, or is it more of a kind of a gut feeling? You just know, hey, this isn't working. I don't know exactly why, but it's just not quite working.
Well, it's hell at first because you have no clue and you've got this big mess. And my agent was like, I don't know what you're going to do with this. I mean, and my agent's great. He incidentally, if he watches this, he'll kill me, but I don't think he actually reads my books, but he does work hard on my proposals and he sells the books. So I'm happy with that. Sorry, Dave, if you do read the books. I kept digging. I mean, the first clue to me was, well, let me just tell a story and I'll get there. So the story is, thank goodness that the Civil War has not been the sole property of academic historians. And
yes.
Even though I teach at a university, I've spent most of my career not in academia. I've never written for other scholars, even though I do scholarship and all of that. That's not my thing. I write for regular folks. But there have always been these dedicated amateurs out there who become obsessed, deeply interested, deeply care about certain stories, and they follow them. And there was this incredible man, now deceased, named Arthur F. Lou, L-O-U-X. And he spent his career working for an insurance company in Pennsylvania. But his passion was the Lincoln assassination, but particular John Wilkes Booth. So in the pre-ancestry.com, pre-newspapers.com era, he diligently searched on weekends, in the evening, I can't imagine how many hours he spent at the National Archives, going and finding every newspaper reference and every documentary reference to John Wilkes Booth. And he ends up putting together this book, posthumously published, called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day. And it's about 200 pages long, and it's got all of these citations and just, hundreds of them. And things like John Wilkes Booth arrived in, Cleveland on the morning of the 14th. He performed Hamlet that night. The next day, he took the train to Indianapolis. The following day, he appeared as Othello, blah, blah, blah. And it's incredibly rich. But as I started to read those actual bits, and particularly the reviews of the critics, I realized that the version of John Wilkes Booth that we'd all been taught, and in my case at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, that Booth was this second-rate actor living jealously in the shadow of his far more famous brother and father actors, that he was this sort of disturbed lone wolf. And I realized that's completely wrong. I mean, Booth was a superstar of the American stage. He would sell out theaters from Chicago and St. Louis to Boston and D.C. Hundreds are turned away from his performances. The critical acclaim is just genius, genius, genius. The New York Times or somebody wrote they had never heard Shakespeare spoken so freshly. Chicago Tribune, there's not a better Shakespearean actor on either side of the Atlantic. I mean, people were just going nuts. Once I realized we had that part of him wrong, then I thought, well, let's look into this other part too. So that got me going on that, but I didn't, the idea of writing, I didn't really want to write a book just about the assassination, because then that didn't really also apply to our own, troubled time as well, too. There's a wonderful speech you can hear online of Ken Follett, the mystery writer and, whatnot, expert on cathedrals, novelist, who's speaking at the Young Men's Hebrew Association in New York City a few years back. And he's giving a book which is a history of the thriller. And it is hilarious. It's erudite. It is just an awesome thing. But on it, he mentions at a certain point an assassination story. And he talks about Day of the Jackal and other, books like that. And he said, an assassination story just works like the 12-bar blues. I mean, you've got a beginning, you've got an end, it's all there. And I thought, well, that isn't bad. But the more and I will be quiet, Josh, I promise. The more I dug into that last year, the Civil War, I realized, good God, how close we came to not having the country that we have today. I mean, it's by the skin of our teeth that we hold it together. And then realizing, how, the wilderness and Spotsylvania are like the lost children of the Civil War. Nobody ever talks about them. In fact, veterans, there's hardly any monuments at either one. They're not that hard to get. They're a little hard to get to, but they're not that far off the highway. There's no big center like at Gettysburg. There's an outdoor kind of covered open air set of maps behind faded plexiglass, and these are gigantic battles. And once I started digging in things, I said, well, maybe it's that last year of the war. That's going to be my spine. And let me talk about the war. Let me talk about the assassination, all the assassination attempts of Lincoln. And then I discovered this Confederate, discover this Confederate terror war. And then it went. But there was one other thing, and I will be quiet after this. And the vast majority of Civil War books, 85% or whatever, are military histories. And I love military history. I'm not knocking that at all, but they're about generals and regiments and battles, okay? Then there's a literature of Lincoln, certainly. I don't know if there's more books written about him than anyone, but anyway, there's a lot of those and books written about political figures of the era. Then there's a sliver of books about African Americans during the Civil War and a sliver of books about women. But the reality is that the Civil War was the first modern war. And it starts out like a Napoleonic war. It ends like World War I. But it's the first war where the entire societies are mobilized on both sides, to win. And women are crucial in this, but you can't find them in most Civil War histories. Ditto for African Americans. And so what I wanted to do is to see if I could put these different streams together, because it's a more realistic reflection of what's going on in the country at the time. And it just took a long time to figure out what it is. But as the books, the narrative is only 300 pages or something. There's a lot of stuff I had to leave out, and I was happy to. Like I punt Reconstruction policy. I don't really talk about the fights within the Republican Party. Generally, I get rid of stuff because I'm trying to have a narrative that the average reader is going to want to keep turning the page and learn more about this, and hopefully want to read more things after they've read it.
Yeah, and to that end, I think you absolutely nailed it. And it was, when I received the book, I get sent quite a few books, you receive one, and frankly, you don't always open every single book you get sent. It's, difficult to do. And probably it is a bit of a serendipitous moment. I've been researching the Civil War extensively over the past few months, working on a narrative podcast series about it. So I'm intensely focused on it. And I finished the first show. It's a big old long thing about the outbreak of the war. Right. So I'm working my way through it. So when I received your book, I'd already had it in my brain and was just thinking about it, basically eating, waking, sleeping. And so I tore through it, and it reads like an absolute thriller. I mean, it's such an easy read. And I know just from kind of working through, picking out, okay, what is important about this conflict, because there is so much there. Yeah. And it is, I mean, like you say, you end up removing things that there's a lot to them. There's a lot of meat on that bone, but they just don't quite fit within a narrative. And so, in reading it, I had such an appreciation for the way you were able to focus it and bind it to a narrative spine while also exploring some of these little things here and there. And it worked. And I know just from doing the sort of research I've been doing, I know that's difficult. So I would commend you there.
Well, it is. I've sort of developed a rule over the years, and the rule is, and I've done it with I learned it with some of my other books, which is, you've got this one narrative line you're following or whatever it is. You can do one step away from the narrative line if the material is really good. All right. And then you can step back the line. You can't go 2 steps away. If it isn't pushing you forward, if it's not either, defining character or moving the story along, it's, you leave that for somebody else. And, thank goodness there's a lot of books on the Civil War. So most of these things are covered by someone else anyway. So
there's quite a bit. I'm sure in this process you were doing a lot of, I guess, ear on the ground to maybe what Civil War discourse is today. Something I have found in doing a lot of this research is I'm now sort of paying attention. I have my antenna up for how's the Civil War being discussed now in 2025, and how is it relevant to the sort of conversations we're having now collectively. And I'm curious, what is your thoughts and feelings about how the Civil War is discussed today and what it means?
So the funny thing on that is that I haven't really paid that much attention. So I went to college in the early to mid 1970s. I went to graduate school, in the late 70s, early 80s, and this was a time, and I decided not to become a college professor, but this was a time when kind of the last of the narrative historians were still around and writing narrative history. And then it was the rise of the theorists and things like that. And I also worked for 10 years at the Smithsonian at the American History Museum, and I saw kind of the last of the collectors who were curators, knew everything about buttons or stamps or whatever, and organized their shows. And then you got the sort of the more theoretical graduate school trained historians. So I've been, I was raised in a storytelling culture. That's sort of what I want to do. I think that, for me at least, that's the best way to do it. So I've been less concerned about that. I guess my question would be, certainly outside of the East Coast. I mean, I wonder where the Civil War is taught. I mean, certainly, I took a graduate course from, Bob Durden, an old Southern scholar, on the history of the Civil War and stuff like that, and loved it, loved the literature and all of that, and had been, certainly my mentors were all connected to the war through their family history or one thing or another. So I don't know. I'm not sure. What have you learned? How is the war being taught or not taught?
Yeah, no, it seems to me, and I don't know if I'm even a great speaker on this, I guess, but
more than I do.
Well, and no, it seems that depending on where you are, it's taught slightly differently, which should probably surprise nobody.
Right.
But it does seem that a lot of the maybe pre-Civil War political discussions they're not put to bed once and for all.
Right.
And I think there's different theories about why that is. So you might get a different answer depending on who you ask and when you ask them. But I do think that there's sort of this connection between, pre-Civil War and Reconstruction era. And, war, as is often said, it's just an extension of policy. It's policy by other means.
Right.
And while the war did have a finality in terms of, you look at the United States before the Civil War, it's like this
Right.
confederation, this string of individual states. It's not a nation necessarily. The United States after the Civil War is very much, more like what it is now. It's the seeds of what it becomes now. So in that sense, it does seem like you have a stark difference before and after. And yet, and I think you touch on this, especially in your notes, I think you wrote about Jubal Early, how he's very involved in the historiography early
He's
after Civil War.
president of the Southern Historical Association.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So he's got a lot to say, and he and others, I think, initially shaped that narrative, and that it swings, and it's very hard to, I think, put a finger on the pulse of it, because it's a living, breathing thing. How the war is talked about and felt, and what it means to different people in different places and different times. It's so difficult to say, this is how it's being taught. But I do think that if you go to Montgomery, Alabama, you're probably going to get a version. And if you go to New York, you're going to get a slightly different version. And it's probably just in terms of emphasis.
Sure.
So,
what I found when I was doing this, and over the decades, I had read the big books and seen the movies and Ken Burns and all that stuff. So I had some sense of that. And they're pivotal too. I mean, the movie Gettysburg, it really, that is a watershed at how the Civil War is portrayed in American cinema. Glory was too, but especially Gettysburg. But when I found a new piece of scholarship that was relevant, if I'm writing about Richmond, in late 1864, 1865, there might be some material I could find and use. But really, my thing was, you can't see it, but from my office window, I can hit with a baseball the second largest university library in the United States. And only Harvard is bigger. The University of Michigan Library, they have everything, or they will get it for you. It's the most amazing thing. So I had, while writing this, at any one time, any week I had 100 books checked out. But every regimental history on both sides, all of these memoirs of not only officers, but of common soldiers. I just had so much material, and that's what I really mined. And, looking for the anecdote, looking for the description of how things sounded, what the wind was like, all of this stuff. And that's really where I plugged into, to do this. So I think that accounts a little bit for why the book may feel different than other books.
Yeah. Well, one thing you did with the book was you focused on John Wilkes Booth and his role in things. And maybe it's my own ignorance, but I think I just sort of took for granted his role in all of this.
Right.
But you do spend quite a bit of time sort of playing out his different movements and what they mean and why they're important. What was the importance of bringing out Booth's connections to the Confederacy and sort of placing him in his role in history kind of in the correct light? How important was that for you with this?
Well, I thought it was important to do. I mean, if we'd gotten his personality so wrong that he wasn't a second-rate actor, that that his role in the society, that he wasn't. I mean, John Wilkes Booth was an incredible actor. Somebody sort of teased me the other day that said that I had rehabilitated his acting reputation. But the fact of the matter was, he was also racist. He was a white supremacist, even though he did not come from a slaveholding family. He grew up in Maryland, a slaveholding state. He was a great ally of the Confederacy. He described himself as a Confederate. So I thought that was very important and that needed to get out there. But the more I dug into it, and I'm not a conspiracy theory type of guy. I've spent 50 years researching and writing about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. I've been fighting conspiracy theories forever. And I don't tend to believe them anyway, in general. The real question, and one reason I'm doing this, the question is, does he think up these things on his own, or is somebody suggesting these things to him? And there is no smoking gun, but there sure is a lot of smoke. And when you look at all of those things one after another, they start to make sense. But Booth is also, what he's doing, and this was not exactly forgotten, but largely forgotten in the popular mind, is that once we have these horrific, costly battles of the wilderness in Spotsylvania in the spring of 1864, it becomes clear to the Confederate High Command that they're not going to win their independence on the battlefield. that ship has sailed. You know, the early great victories that they have are also in part because of the genius of Jackson and Lee and being able to move the army quickly and things like that. They can't do that now. They're stuck in essentially a siege situation in Petersburg and Richmond. So, but they are desperate to maintain their independence, and so they try a new kind of fighting, which is this terror war that they unleash against the civilian population of the North. A lot of it doesn't work, but that doesn't mean they're not trying to do it. And then Booth makes more sense within that context. If you have that context of all the things that they're trying to do, the idea that Confederate Secret Service agents would suggest that he do this, he's got all of these contacts with them, for months. So that to me seemed very significant. And, I just survived a long interview with Dave Taylor of the LincolnConspirators.com, which is the premier site on all of this. So I got out with my scalp. Well, my scalp is gone, but if I'd had one, it would have been there. But, this is going to be stuff that people are going to argue about for a while. And while I don't say definitively, in my mind, there's no question he did not think up these things. And, that these ideas are being planted in his mind. The other thing is, and this has to do with the way the lost cause, amongst other things, has changed our perception. We're still living with it. But I think most Americans think the Civil War ends at Appomattox, and it does not. We have 100,000 determined veteran Confederate soldiers still in the field. It takes some time for the war to end, but for someone like Booth, murdering Lincoln, it's still an act of war, to do so.
Yeah, and you do spend a good bit of time with the Confederate Secret Service and some of the things they're trying to do. Another one of these kind of things that I guess I didn't realize. I mean, I knew that there were attempted assassinations on Lincoln, especially before his first inauguration. Like, he dresses up in a shawl and, he goes in disguise to his inauguration, and, there's all that. But I guess, I don't know, I just hadn't seen a whole lot of time being spent on these attempted assassinations prior to, the last year, prior to the Booth assassination attempt. Talk about that a little bit, because there's quite a bit there that it's not that it's glossed over, but there's this moment, and then there's this moment, and then, could have, and it's just so wild, I guess, maybe thinking about things with a modern mind and being like, how on earth, why is his carriage open? Why has he got, I don't know. Like, it's just.
No. Well, I mean, that's one of, we have to kind of remember to put ourselves back in 1864, 1865. There's no functioning Secret Service like we would know it. I mean, Lincoln has an occasional bodyguard and stuff like that. But, the fact, so during the summer months, as you know, Washington, D.C. is miserable. I spent many summers there. And so to get out of, I mean, it's said that early British diplomats got, hazard pay for having to stay in D.C. during the summer. I don't know whether it's true or not. It's a good story, though. But, the Lincoln family would move to the soldiers' home near the northern tip of the district, at higher ground, more breezes and stuff like that. But Lincoln would work in the White House during the day and go home at night. He would ride alone on horseback. He enjoyed doing that. And, I recount this one night when he's doing that, as he's nearing the gates of the soldiers' home, the sentries hear a shot, and somebody has tried to kill Lincoln. They shot through his top hat, so within inches of going through his head. And, and they go retrieve the hat. And then Lincoln was always embarrassed that he had snuck himself through Baltimore. He just, that was embarrassing him. But, Lincoln also had such faith in most people that he thought, nobody's really going to want to kill me. It's just not going to happen. And so he convinced these soldiers to sort of shut up about it and not get out. Then we have a second, possible attempt when Lewis Powell is lurking, in the snowy evening in the bushes between the War Department and, in the White House, and he's waiting for Lincoln, but there's another man with him, and he sort of loses his nerve at that point. and you read about these people offering money. There's rumors that the Confederates had offered money. And early on in the book too, we meet this former Georgetown teacher, Thomas Conrad, who he planned early in the war that he was going to kill General Winfield Scott and shoot him in his carriage. And the Confederates heard about it and they convinced him not to, not because they were opposed to assassination, but they were worried if Scott was killed, doddering old Scott, that they might have a more effective general. So I think there's been a lot of, things have been massaged with rose-colored glasses over the years. And I just tried to focus on the things that we know happened or that we believe happened.
Yeah, you mentioned Lincoln is such a fascinating character because
oh gosh, absolutely.
There's so many wrinkles and nuances to him. I mean, you've got this brilliant guy, but he also seems to have lapses in judgment, namely when it comes to his own personal safety.
Yeah.
He just, people around him. I mean, he's famously got the bodyguard Ward Lamont, who's
right.
always with him. He's his shadow, and there's I've read quite a few letters where his bodyguard's writing to other people about the president's safety, and you're right. There's this sort of bashfulness, I guess, with regard to Lincoln's safety, and I don't know if I'm curious your take on it, because it seems like there's he views himself as this sort of symbol of the American Republican ideal, but it's also kind of this, I don't know, his personality is one of reticence and kind of withdrawnness, but he clearly can logically deduce things and sort of take things apart, and brilliant. But it's this thing that seems to sort of, I don't know, it seems to be illogical at times.
Well, and it was a great challenge early on trying to figure out how do I deal with Lincoln, and because we all have this image of him, is this the northern version of the Marble Man, and with malice towards none, and on and on. And I was reminded of the great American film director John Ford, who in the late 1930s does this movie Young Mr. Lincoln, and when he was casting it, he approaches this young up and coming star movie actor named Henry Fonda and says, I'd like you to play Lincoln. And Fonda says, oh no, hell no, I could never do that. He's a great man. And Ford is like, shut up, you idiot. I'm not talking about that guy. I'm talking about the young lawyer in Dinkyville, Illinois. And Fonda was, oh, okay, I can do that. So the book opens with Tad Lincoln, the youngest surviving son. And what I wanted to do is remind everybody that Lincoln is a human being who puts his pants on one leg at a time, and that not only did the country lose its great president, but, kids lost their father, a wife lost her husband, and I talk about his physical maladies. I wanted to sort of bring a humanness to him, but Lincoln is, I don't know that we deserved him. To me, he's head and shoulders, the great American figure. He's an astonishing man, but he was also very weird. With dreams and seances and just all of this stuff. He was just something else. I'm surprised that nobody has mentioned this one sentence I write about him, which is when I'm talking about after, Spotsylvania and the wilderness, and, Lincoln and Grant are determined to go on. And I say, but Lincoln was also a stone cold killer, and he was willing to send a lot of men to their deaths because he was determined to destroy slavery at any cost.
Yeah, he does have that killer instinct a little bit, doesn't he? I'm trying to remember there's a quote I'm thinking of, and I can't remember who said it or exactly what the quote was, but it's the essence of it is he's a slippery operator. He's a politician in the supreme sense, but also he is this guy who teaches himself warfare, bringing to bear all this ability to study from his lawyering days. And, by the end of the war, you look up and you go, man, that was a fantastic war leader, all things considered. And you're right. He's from Bumpkinville, Illinois.
But he was also wise enough for example, and Sherman's march, is a key moment in the book as well, too. But, I mean, Sherman was an absolute genius, and it's the Brits who realized that first. And we're just, he's painted as this brutal monster, blah, 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 blah. But, Lincoln did not want Sherman to go off the map and to do the March of the Sea. But Lincoln had the ability to realize that Sherman and Grant knew more than he did, and I'll leave it to you all to figure out how we do this. That takes great leadership as well too, to not let your ego get so involved in something that was absolutely dear, central to his life, and but that he trusted certain people to do certain things.
And yes, and he treats different generals differently. I've been reading a lot about his treatment of McClellan earlier on in the war.
Right.
And Grant and Sherman both, throughout the war, build this cachet with Lincoln. They build trust, where early on, Lincoln is very involved with different decisions, mostly because he's just not seeing the fruit of different decisions. He's looking at the grand strategy of it, and he's saying, why shouldn't we do this? And McClellan's saying, no, let's do that. Well, by the end of the war, Grant and Sherman have proven, hey, we know what works. We've developed a strategy that will win the war, and Lincoln believes them. And you're right. He takes his hands off the wheel and he says, those guys know what they're doing. And he just sort of waits and trusts that they will.
And that's incredible. I mean, more so than FDR. I mean, for a war leader, that's just remarkable that he does that. And, and it's also, he doesn't care about their background. I mean, people forget. I mean, Sherman was a banker in San Francisco for a while. He was the head of a military academy in Louisiana. Grant was sort of a failure. I mean, frankly, until the war gets going, and that didn't mean anything to Lincoln. It's who you are and what you can produce.
Absolutely. So I'm a nerd, so I was reading the notes.
Good, I'm
at
glad.
the end of the book. I love reading footnotes. You wrote a footnote about the writer Shelby Foote, and
Yes.
I think if you're thinking about the Civil War, he's probably one of those names that kind of comes to your mind along with a few others. I'm curious. You wrote it out in very plain English, how Shelby Foote in your mind sort of fits into the diagram of historiography about the Civil War, but just sort of explain. He is a figure that is almost kind of mythic, sort of in his own right. If you're a Civil War nut,
Right.
There's like this Faulkner-esque kind of quality to him. It's just like a different sort of a character, and yet he writes this massive, 3-volume narrative. So I'm curious, just how does he kind of fit into the puzzle? I guess getting somebody that kind of comes out maybe from the left field. And sort of writes this thing, and how does he fit into the overall story of this?
Sure. So, I mean, Foote is, and certainly the 3rd volume came out when I was, I think, in college or in graduate school. So, and I was, I studied the South, and I studied in the South, and with people who were, I cut my teeth on Faulkner and all of that as well, too. So very involved in Southern literature. I take Shelby Foote to task because he writes black people out of the war. Mm-hmm. And, they just don't show up in the first 2 volumes at all. And if so, in a dismissive way that they're not important. Whereas Lincoln, for example, said if it wasn't for the African-American Union troops, that we would not have won the war, period. I mean, there's all there's to it. And there's lots of evidence to support that. So, by the time that Foote gets to the 3rd volume, the civil rights movement has happened. Martin Luther King has been murdered in Foote's hometown of Memphis. And Foote later admits in an interview that he had wished that he had supported the movement, and he didn't. And so there were regrets there, but he came from a certain mindset of a certain time. And, that isn't necessarily damning. It's just a reality. I mean, everybody, none of us can live or take credit or be damned for what our grandparents did. They lived their lives in their era. We're living ours in ours. But those books are there. It is an American Iliad. I mean, the writing is fantastic for what it is. Okay. And, but as the story of the Civil War, there's a whole lot that just isn't in it. And we don't have anything of quite of that quality. Now, I do praise in the book Douglas Southall Freeman, who was
Right.
of a even earlier generation. And, and his biography of Lee is, I mean, of course, he's writing from a racist, paternalistic perspective. No surprise. But the research is so good. It's a book that's going to live beyond that. People are going to be able to look beyond those, what we would perceive as flaws in his character and his understanding. And you do it. Foote is still, even though he's deceased, he's still a figure because we don't have anything that massive and that sweeping. It hasn't been done yet. So that person should start to get to work.
Well, I was about to ask you, what is kind of I know you've written the book because you found the gap, but sort of what do you think maybe is the gap in what's being written about the Civil War, or perhaps as somebody who wrote a book about the Civil War, what do you think might be kind of the trend on the upswing? Maybe it's not quite hit its peak yet, but maybe how you see scholarship or general discourse about it. How do you think it might sort of change in the next, I don't know, maybe 10 years or something?
Well, I and I'm probably going to lose sales here. I'm less optimistic about what most scholars will do because we've just been in, it's like it happened to English departments. I mean, English critics in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they were read by the public. That's gone by the wayside because regular people cannot understand, these analyses of literature. History has been doing its best to catch up. And, history it's a story. It's it should be a story, is a story. It's a narrative, and that's how you get people to learn. So the real question will be, in this next crop of writers, the best historians in general that we've had now in this country for 30 years, popular historians, they're all former journalists. And, Robert Caro, people like that. You'll run into Ambrose, McCullough, people like that. You'll run into some. Doris Kearns Goodwin has sort of gone, both ways. But it's people who come from a tradition of writing for everyday readers, everyday educated readers, and things like that. So I would hope that as we have more women writing about the Civil War, that I think we'll see women start to play a larger part in it. And there's going to be a lot of research that's going to have to be done to do that. Women show up in Midnight in the Potomac more than they do in most Civil War histories. But it took digging to find the accounts. I mean, they're there, but there aren't the numbers of them, compared to memoirs by, generals and soldiers, things like that. So I would think that that's going to be something that's going to happen, but it'll also just depend on how the political winds blow in the country, what we're going to be like in the next 20 years and what's going to seem, important. But to me, to this day, the Civil War remains the single most important event in American history, even more so than the Revolution. It's the time when definitions of who we are as Americans, what we believe, and who is allowed to be full partners in this great experiment, in the world's greatest experiment in democracy, were in high relief. It's the bloodiest war in our history. I was raised, Josh, by the World War II generation. My dad was, in the Army Air Corps. My mom worked for the Army. All my uncles were in uniform. I had an aunt who was a wave. My Boy Scout leaders, Little League coaches, all of that. And, 1 out of every 300 Americans died during World War II. For Vietnam, it was like 1 out of every 3,500 or something like that. For the Civil War, it was 1 out of 50. I mean, every family lost someone, every extended family. And during the course of the Civil War, 1 out of every 7 Americans goes from being enslaved to being free. I mean, this is just such a pivotal moment, and we're still unpacking it, to this day.
It is so difficult, I think, just to put in perspective. You grow up and you think that, we're 150 years on from it, how intensely can we still feel some of the things collectively as a people, as a country? How can we still be feeling some of these things this far away removed?
Yeah.
And yet, I think the more you read and the more you kind of dig into it and sink your teeth into it, you realize it's not just in one aspect. It's not just the obvious stuff, the abolition of slavery. It's not just that. It's what was America beforehand and what is it today, and you see the through lines where things have changed, and you're sort of starting to reckon with what as we're coming up on the 250th, as the founding fathers decided, here's this experiment essentially that we're going to set up. In my mind, the Civil War era defines what that meant. And then now we're sort of living with the ramifications of that. So it's one of those things where you think, how prevalent can it really be for Americans? And the more you dig into it, you realize, like you said, it's the single most important period for everything. I mean, it's social, political, interpersonal, it's everything. It's where America really kind of becomes America for good or ill.
Right. Absolutely. No, absolutely. And, even though I've been bitching about historians and stuff like that, don't take it too seriously. I mean, the literature is terrific. I mean, the contemporary literature from the period, they're still finding something. I mean, one of the thrills for me was, discovering, for me at least, this Lois Adams, this single mom who was a Washington correspondent for Detroit newspapers. And that was due to the diligent efforts of a librarian at the Central Michigan University Library who collected all this stuff and, published it as a book. And her stuff is great. I mean, she's one of the most lyrical writers of the era, and she's just on top of stuff. And I just try to use her as much as I could because I thought her insights are great. So there's still plenty to discover. I mean, we're just beginning, to put that together. Absolutely.
So a couple things here just about the process for you for writing history. This, I guess, extends further just beyond Midnight on the Potomac, but just if you're looking at your writing at a whole, do you always kind of start with a story you want to tell, or is it more of a theme you want readers to take away? How do those things, that decision between those two things, how does that kind of guide the decisions you make when you're writing?
Well, one thing you want to do, and I don't know whether this was Follett or Stephen King who said this, and it might have been somebody else, but they said that whatever the first chapter is or the first little bit of any book, and this could apply to fiction as well too, in that person's mind, had to pose a question that the reader absolutely had to know what the answer was. So you have to set a hook early, and you do that. And I read fiction, a lot of fiction, and I love I love Dickens and Faulkner and Hemingway and the Brontes and on and on and on, all those great authors. I love reading their stuff, and I use whatever techniques I can steal to help keep things going, keeps things moving, leave things with question marks at the ends of sections. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or whether I'm going on another rabbit trail here. I tried to keep the because reading is going downhill. We now have, I'm the father of 23-year-old twin sons. So they've grown up with, phones in their hands and things like that. I've tried to keep the sections short, have page breaks, have one sentence paragraphs to help break up the page. So you're trying to do things that in our impatient era right now will keep people going, but also get them involved in the story. You also want them to have people they can root for and root against. And, I found, and this was one reason I started with Tad Lincoln is that he had been portrayed kind of as a little brat and that he, wasn't very nice and attention hog. And then the more I read about him, I realized that's really not him at all. I mean, and he's this sweet, loving, challenged little boy. And I thought, Well, that's somebody people can root for, or they'll be interested in him at least. So you try to do things like that.
Yeah. This is, I guess, maybe a two-part question.
Sure.
But, what is the mistake that you're seeing first-time history writers make when they're trying to turn research into narrative, or maybe they're trying to tell a narrative, but they're trying to figure out kind of the relationship between the research and the narrative?
I think the big problem is that there is the temptation to put all of your research into the book, because there's going to be some research that other people are going to find interesting, and there's other research that you're like the only person in the world that really finds it interesting. It's very hard not to want to put all of this hard work that you've done, and your parents and your wife and others saying, "Oh, you've worked so hard on this, you got to put that in," and stuff like that. It's just not the case. You need to, Kurt Vonnegut said, "Pity the reader," and so what you want to do, and I've always kept in the back of my mind for years. I kept in the back of mind my Aunt Connie. My mom was the oldest of four sisters. She was the youngest. Aunt Connie never went to college or anything like that, but she was fun and smart and interesting. Is this a story that Aunt Connie might follow, or is there something she might find, interesting in that? So you just you have to try to imagine yourself not as you, but as whatever this ideal reader is out there and doing it. I think the other thing is, and this is difficult for scholars and less so once they've gotten tenure or whatnot or gotten a job, but it's you have all of these predecessors who've done this work before you, and they're this Greek chorus that you're constantly feeling you need to answer this theory or that theory, and that doesn't help a book. You can put that in your footnotes or whatever. Try to tell a story that's going to engage your readers.
That's good. Last thing here, if you're thinking back,
we're just getting warmed up, Josh. I can go all night.
I could too. What's something that, if you're thinking back, looking at the rear view mirror down the road of the stuff you've researched, the books you've written, what is something that you have learned by writing history that maybe newbies wouldn't know?
One thing, it's doing this is a craft, and you learn the craft by doing it. You need to read a lot, and you need to pay attention. You need to read good stuff and try to understand how certain writers are doing things. But the more pages in the old days, the more pages that went through the typewriter, the better you should be able to get if you're really striving for something that you think is going to grab somebody's attention. That's work of significance that says something to your our country or whoever your readers are or whatever. So I think that's part of it. I think you need to, and what'll happen is you'll get quicker as you go along. One thing two books ago, I wrote a book called The World Beneath Their Feet, and it's the story of a great race between British, American, and German who become Nazi mountain climbers to be the first to climb one of the great peaks of the Himalayas. And the book is set in the 30s mainly. The war sort of interrupts things, and then eventually ends in the early 50s when Hillary and Tenzing, climbed the top of Mount Everest. But and the story is about the war, the drumbeat of the war happening. It's about the rising anti-colonialism in British India and all of these different things on the way. While I was doing research for this, I'd run into some killer account by some Polish, mountaineering team trying to climb some, very dangerous peak in the Himalayas. And I realized finally that I get enthralled with this stuff, and I realize if I can't see anything that I'm reading out of this book or this article showing up as a sentence in my actual book, I have to close the book and put it aside because it's interesting, but it's not, it doesn't help me get from A to B. So I think it's you have to be, you need to be laser focused, but you also need to be open to, if you run into something like, gosh, this is such a great story, or this really adds this element that I don't have. Is there a way I can fit it in and to have it work? That goes back to the one step if it's really good, but you can't go 2 steps away.
When you're in the process of working on a book, what surrounds you? What's that sort of space look like where you're, writing the words and you got the books around you, the Post-it notes? What's that sort of, space look like? Is there a routine that's rigorous, or is it kind of just?
Well, I'll tell you the funny thing. This is what I look at. I look at a blank wall.
There you go.
And I keep it blank on purpose. I write 7 days a week. And I work 7 days a week, and it's only 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon or something like that, but I do it. I teach in the morning 4 days a week at Michigan, and then I go to work on my writing, either researching or writing itself. One thing I did do when I did my second book, The Secret Game, I kept a log book. I got one of these little Lecturum notebooks. And I would write a number every day, date every day, and I'd write just a short paragraph, 2 or 3 sentences about what I did that day. Then at the bottom, I would write how many words I wrote that day, and then I'd also write how many words I had cumulatively. And some days the number would be like I threw out 1,000 words, or whatever it is it went. But this came from my dad was a petroleum geologist. And he told a story about driving across the state of Kansas, going from the east to the west, in his, Model A, Ford in the 30s or something like that. And Kansas is very flat, but he kept noticing as he's driving that the engine kept overheating, and he couldn't figure out why. And it was because he thought he was flat, but he's actually gaining all of this elevation slowly. And that was my way of trying. I also got a big map of Kansas, and I would put little pins along it to show where I was. And it just seems like I'm never going to get there. It's going so slow. But, you write 100 words a day. Well, here's the question, Josh. If you write 1 page a day, what do you have after 1 year?
You've got 365 pages.
You've got 365 pages. So, it's a marathon you're running. But I do think consistency is key. You got to keep your spirits up too. I'm not above bribing myself. Like when you finish this difficult chapter, you get to buy a CD or some whatever in the heck it is. And it's hard work, and do it. And meeting other writers can be helpful if you're both dedicated to the work. I'm very lucky in that I have an agent, an editor. Even though we're different in many ways, we're all about just trying to do good work. And that's great to have a team like that.
Again, I'm such a sucker for process and how people tackle things. I could talk
this forever.
This is so good. I have a background writing fiction before I was doing this podcasting thing. And so just, the way that people tackle writing projects to me is so fascinating, because I think the number of people that there are, that's the number of different ways that people decide they want to go about doing it.
Yeah.
I know with nonfiction, there's an element of planning that is just sort of baked into the process. But how much of it is you sit down and to a intense degree, how much do you know is what's going on the page beforehand? Or is it more, okay, I've got these overarching ideas and I've got these overarching events, and I'm just going to sort of sit down and kind of just feel my way through it? What does that sort of process look like for you?
Well, no, I would say it's really quite, there's a lot of planning. Hold on just a second. Let me just grab one of these boards here if I can. This is what I do in terms of early on when I'm trying to figure out how to do things. And I might put these on different levels to follow different streams of thought. So, when I wrote my book proposal for The Secret Game, I mean, it was like 80 pages long, and I had, maybe 30 pages of, description of what happens in each chapter and all that stuff. And I'll still do that, although things can change as it goes along. You realize oh, I don't need to write that much, or I really need to add this, or I can switch this around. Again, trying to keep dramatic tension up, trying to keep the narrative going, and trying to have unanswered questions that pop up. But I certainly plan out. There are novelists who will not start writing a novel until they know what they're writing on the last page.
Right.
I've never been that, but I've known it's gonna, I'm aiming towards something at the end, something beyond just an event, but something going on. But I would say I have a real that goes back to the making the Chinese meal metaphor and getting everything laid out and chopped up and measured out and all this, everything's all set and all the dishes are in order as to when you add them to the wok and things like that. So I do a lot of that ahead of time. Absolutely. I know a novelist who quite famous these days, but he would I knew him when we were both much younger, but he said that, I never know how a book's going to end until I start writing. And that might have been BS. I don't know, but that's certainly not the way I do it. And, and you learn along the way too. I was thinking about, with The Secret Game, I was writing about race and the Civil War, and then I was writing about Kansas, and I started writing all this stuff about, the border wars in Kansas, and I'm writing about a game that happens during World War II. And my editor, he cut out like 100 pages or something. He said, no, you're hearing too many hoofbeats and stuff. We got to keep focused. So, you have a job to do, and you're trying to do that job.
Is there anything about Midnight on the Potomac that you have not been asked yet, but you're really itching for somebody just to be like, oh, I've got a question. You're like, thank goodness somebody finally asked me this.
Well, I already mentioned that Lincoln was a stone cold killer. No, although it's been funny. So I've started a book tour. I've spoken in St. Louis, in Tulsa, Washington, D.C., Shepherdstown, West Virginia, New York City, and Boston. And then I've got 9 cities I'm going to between now and Christmas. One thing that's happened, well, the first 2 places I was asked whether Mary Surratt was guilty or not. And I really kind of punt all that. I mean, I didn't really know. I'm not sure. But it's been interesting. I've got a lot of questions I'm given about, you have this public talk and you're talking, I give my talk. And then it's sort of presumed that you're expert on everything. I got a question of, can I please explain changes in ordnance in the North during the course of the war? And of course, I had nothing, stuff like that. So you're asked a lot of things that you don't address. No, I don't think so. The one question that I have gotten a couple times that makes me smile. So the book is dedicated to my parents, and my dad was he became Colonel Elmer Ellsworth after the war, but during World War II, he was a major in the Army Air Corps. And a number of people have asked whether I'm related to the real Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who was Lincoln's friend, who was, of course, shot in Alexandria. Ironically, my wife and I had our engagement rehearsal dinner party at that hotel, which was quite odd. But the answer to that is we don't know, because my dad's dad, whose name was Herbert Elmer Ellsworth, deserted the family in 1912, never to be heard from again. We don't know anything about really his background at all. So anyway.
Well, this has been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else that you want to cover before we get out of here?
No, I mean, other really just to, and your listeners know this, but Josh, you are doing just such an incredible job here. And you're a terrific interviewer. You're a terrific reader of books and understander of books as well, too. And you have a great way of really getting to the heart of the issue, and in a very generous, open way. And I just think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. And I think it's a great service to the country. I'm being absolutely honest with that. And I hope you do it forever, because it's terrific.
Well, thank you so much. That does mean quite a lot. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
All right. So Here we go. Here's the commercial.
Yep.
There it is.
Here we go. Midnight on the Potomac. Grab it wherever you grab books. Thank you so much for coming on, Scott.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
The book is Midnight on the Potomac. He is Scott Ellsworth, and I have had a wonderful time. Hope you have as well. If you want to support me and what I'm doing here with Compendium, you can do so on Patreon. You can also do so on Substack. If you do that, you'll get access to all of these episodes early. You'll get some behind the scenes. And additionally, we're announcing something brand new here. You're going to get a completely bonus episode of Compendium when To the Sound of Distant Guns Part 2 comes out. You're also going to get a bonus show. So consider that your little teaser to hop over there to Patreon and Substack and support what I'm doing. I greatly appreciate everybody who chooses to do so. It means the world to me. So thank you all of you for listening, for rating, reviewing, telling a friend, and thank you so much to Scott Ellsworth for coming on the show. Go grab yourself a copy of Midnight on the Potomac. It's an absolute blast of a book. I hope you all grab it and enjoy it. And that will do it for me. I hope to see you all again here very, very soon.